Trustees, and we will begin this morning's meeting with Chairman Abrego. If you could please convene the Committee on Governmental Relations.
Thank you, Chairman Day. Will the Committee on Governmental Relations please come to order? I note that no one has requested to address the committee during the public comment period today, so it's now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Are there any objections to the approval of the consent agenda? Hearing none, the consent agenda is approved. The committee has two items on today's discussion agenda. Item 2 is an information item, a state legislative update. The item will be presented by Garrett Ashley, Vice Chancellor for University Relations and Advancement, and Nicole Munoz Murillo, Director of State Relations. Please begin, Garrett.
Thank you, Trustee Abrego. The legislature concluded their work for this legislative year on September 13th and have adjourned until January. More than 700 bills still await the governor's signature or veto. Of that total, about 25 are relevant to the CSU. I'd like to thank our advocacy and state relations team, campuses, and Chancellor's Office colleagues who have all contributed to the CSU's advocacy effort over the last 9 months. These collaborative efforts have allowed the CSU to be effective in providing background information, answering questions, sharing fiscal details, and engaging members of the legislature and their staff as we share the impact of proposed legislation on the CSU. Director of State Relations, Nicole Munoz Murillo, will provide an overview of notable it's early developments in Sacramento in the final months of session, give an update on legislation that could impact the CSU, and provide a preview of our fall advocacy activities. Nicole?
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Ashley. The legislature has been very busy since our last report. After reconvening from their summer recess, the legislature worked intently to meet the August 30th fiscal deadline, when all bills had to be passed out of the Appropriations Committee. The legislature then had 2 weeks to make any final amendments, take floor votes, and advance bills to the governor for his consideration. The governor now has until October 13th to sign or veto legislation. Your agenda captures the status of bills as of September 11th. It is organized into 4 sections to provide you with a snapshot of where bills stand as we near the halfway point of the 2-year session. The first section lists active bills, which are bills that were still being debated and voted on at the end of session or were already on their way to the governor. Inactive bills refers to bills that were held in appropriations committees and are not expected to move this session. The third section lists 2-year bills, which are bills that have taken a pause but could still advance next year. The final section lists bills that the governor has already signed or vetoed. I'll begin with an update on sponsored legislation. I'm very pleased to report that AB 829 by Assemblymember Richard Bloom, found on page 12 of your agenda, was signed by the governor at the end of August. The bill received strong bipartisan support throughout the legislative process. The CSU now has the authority to offer occupational therapy doctorate programs. On behalf of our team, I want to thank Academic and Student Affairs, Dominguez Hills, and San Jose State for their partnership in successfully helping us usher the bill through the process. The other CSU-sponsored legislation proposed a ballot measure to go before voters to fund CSU and UC infrastructure needs. Ultimately, the legislature and governor came to an agreement on a combined preschool to higher education bond measure contained in AB 48 by Assemblymember Patrick O'Donnell and Senator Steve Glazer. This bill is summarized on page 2 of your agenda. Assistant Vice Chancellor Kathleen Chavira will provide a comprehensive update on this issue in the next agenda item. Now I'd like to turn to highlights from this legislative year. You may recall at the beginning of the legislative session, we noted several higher education bill trends, including financial aid reform, student well-being, and higher education coordination and data. These indeed were priorities of the legislature and the administration. With that said, as you review 2-year bills, which begin on page 9 of, these indeed were the priorities of the legislature and the administration. With that said, as you review 2-year bills, which begin on page 9 of your agenda, you will note that many relate to these priorities. In some cases, the legislature and administration took action in the 2019 budget to address these issues, making legislation unnecessary. In other cases, bills were made into two-year bills to provide more time for continued conversation. For instance, the budget agreement resulted in several significant financial aid investments, including 2 years of free community college, an expansion of competitive Cal grants, and funding for summer study grants at the CSU and UC. As a result, a number of financial aid bills were put on pause. We anticipate there will be continued conversation on financial aid reform in the coming year. We will work to ensure that our students benefit from any proposed changes. Moving to page 7 of your agenda, you will find the list of inactive bills, which is then followed by a list of two-year bills. These lists include several bills that were of concern to the CSU, and we are very grateful that the legislature has either paused or halted these measures. Since the completion of your written agenda item, only one bill we oppose made its way to the governor. That bill is SB 206 by Senator Nancy Skinner, which can be found on page 5 of your agenda. This bill, beginning in 2023, prohibits any athletic association, the CSU, the UC, or an independent college or university from preventing a student athlete from earning compensation for the use of the student's name, image, or likeness. As the bill places campuses in direct conflict with NCAA rules, we are concerned that it will jeopardize the ability of our students to participate in intercollegiate athletics. As the bill's impacts go well beyond our system, there are numerous voices weighing in on this legislation. According to recent press accounts, if the bill is ultimately signed into law, the NCAA may consider legal action. In the meantime, we have submitted a veto request letter and conveyed our concerns regarding the bill's impact to our campuses and our students. We will keep you apprised of the governor's final actions on this and other bills of interest to the CSU. Finally, even as the legislative year is winding down, we are already implementing our fall advocacy strategies and planning for 2020. We have planned several campus visits for key legislative staff, the Legislative Analyst's Office, and the Department of Finance. These campus visits provide an opportunity for leadership, budget, and policy staff to learn about campus budget processes, enrollment management, unique campus programs, and efforts to realize Graduation Initiative 2025 goals. We are also preparing for our next budget advocacy season, identifying new ways to build on the effective relationships that have been central to our successful advocacy efforts. As always, these efforts will rely on the partnership with campuses. That includes my state update, and we are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Nicole, for your presentations. Are there any questions or comments from the board? Romy?
Good morning. As I assume all of us trustees, I'm always super impressed when I get to campuses and see what the faculty does, what the students do. And I think it's so important that we bring legislators to the campuses. So when they actually see where the money literally goes, how it is applied, how we integrate students, not only like we teach them in the classroom, how we involve them in research, what kind of facilities we have on the campuses, and of course, our cost associated with this. I think this is very, very helpful. If you can manage to bring the legislators onto campus, I think it leaves an impact that they will never forget.
Jane?
Yes, you reviewed some things about financial aid, but that was a major issue for CSSA last year. Could you just review what pieces of the reform that they wanted have occurred and which ones haven't?
Well, I would leave, I'll speak to what I know, and I do know that they supported quite a few different measures, and that they were supportive, for instance, of one of them that I mentioned was the expansion of competitive Cal grants that happened. They were also, I believe, supportive of of the summer Cal grant measures. So, again, there are quite a few things in the hopper, and I do think that we've already started discussions with CSSA about how we'll be able to move forward together next year.
You know, on issues like that, I think we should be working very closely with CSSA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Trustee Carney, I would just add, we have all intention of working closely with them this year, and we did in fact meet with them this week and discussed financial aid reform as their priority and ours, and outlined a few ideas that we're already looking at for next year. And we talked about having a meeting in the near future in Sacramento to coordinate with our advocacy and state relations office. So I feel we're off to a very good start for the coming legislative year with CSSA.
Okay, if no further comments or questions, we'll move on to, Jane, did you have a question?
I know we have some NCAA experts amongst our presidents, and I was wondering what they thought about this legislation in terms of our scholar athletes being compensated.
I think it's going to be an unfortunate consequence for the institutions because we will be out of compliance with the NCAA, which will not give us any advantage. I think those in other states will be using this to recruit athletes that we would also be recruiting. And the argument will be they will not be eligible for postseason championships if they go to California. So it's a dual-edged sword. I also think that it will affect a fairly small number of student athletes, not this large population that is being touted.
If I might add, I also think that if students who play in California wish to then transfer to another state, I believe they have lost amateur status if they have compensation, so they may not be able to compete. And I do agree with Diane that I think for the majority of programs in the state, especially in the CSU, they're not money-making programs. They're opportunities for students, and it really would be unfortunate to lose that opportunity.
Trustee Abrego, Trustee Furstenberg, I'm actually the NC2A has created a small national group to think deeply about the name, image, and likeness policy at the NC2A level. I am on that group, and our work is in progress, but I think there will be, coming from the group to the Board of Governors and to the membership at all three levels, there will be some ideas that come out. The pace of the NC2A is deliberative, and so this, depending on what the governor decides to do with this bill or not, there was some interest in making this a 2-year bill in California to let the NC2A finish its work, but that turned out not to be the choice of the legislature and may not be the choice of the governor. The element that everybody is trying to wrestle with is to, if there is to be compensation for name, image, and likeness, how is that not compensation for performance, pay to play? And that, because that then would become crossing a line that intercollegiate athletics doesn't embrace and has never embraced. And so that's trying to thread the needle here. So it's an interesting set of conversations, but they won't be done at the NC2A until next year.
Are there any more questions or comments? Okay, item 3 is an action item seeking committee approval for the support of AB 48, Public Preschool, K-12, and College Health and Safety Bond Act of 2020. The item will be presented by Garrett Ashley, Vice Chancellor for University Relations and Advancements, and Kathleen Chavarria, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Advocacy and State Relations. Please begin, Garrett.
Thank you, Trustee Abrego. Today's presentation is an endorsement for your consideration of the Public Preschool, K-12, and College Health and Safety Bond Act of 2020. This measure was passed as AB 48 in the final hours of the legislative session and is currently awaiting action by the governor. As we have emphasized over the years, and as recently as yesterday, a statewide general obligation bond is a critical element to address the academic infrastructure and deferred maintenance needs reflected in our 5-year capital outlay plan. The College Health and Safety Bond Act is the result of strategic advocacy and engagement by many in the CSU community. I want to extend thanks to Senator and former trustee Steve Glazer and the CSU community who played an important role in getting this measure to the governor. We bring this item before you today for 2 reasons. First, endorsement by the board will allow our campus auxiliary organizations to begin the process of supporting the campaign for the bond, much as they did for the bond campaign in 2006 and Proposition 30 in 2012. Second, once signed, the legislation places the bond on the March 2020 ballot. Timing is critical, as we need to engage in educational and informational activity as soon as possible to ensure the public is aware of the bond's impact. Assistant Vice Chancellor Kathleen Shavira will provide background on AB 48 and details of the specific elements of the bond. Kathleen?
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Ashley. This year, the board sponsored legislation to authorize an $8 billion bond to be divided equally between the UC and the CSU. SB 14, authored by Senator Glazer, served as the vehicle for raising awareness and support for our needs through most of the legislative session. At the same time, AB 848 by Assemblymember O'Donnell was moving on a parallel track and proposed a $13 billion bond for K-12 and community colleges. As we expected, the leadership of both houses and the governor came together in the final 2 weeks of session to combine the 2 measures, ensuring that once signed by the governor, a single bond proposal would go before the voters in March. I want to note a couple of key points. First, all segments realized a reduction in the amount of bond funding initially proposed, with K-12 receiving $9 billion in funding for more than 1,100 school districts, and each public segment of higher education receiving $2 billion. I would also note that historically, the highest level of bond funding received by the CSU was $690 million in 2006. Second, the final amounts were influenced by, and they do reflect, the consistent concerns expressed by the Newsom administration around fiscal prudence during times of economic uncertainty. Finally, a combined measure rather than competing measures was always the goal. The final measure has a long list of supporters across the K through 16 spectrum and ensures collaborative rather than competitive advocacy efforts for March. In addition to providing funding, the bond proposal implements significant programmatic and policy changes to the K-12 school facility program. These include increases in the overall bonding capacity of districts, new requirements to submit 5-year facilities master plans and updated reports of school building capacity, and a type of sliding scale for determining state and local share of project costs based on bonding capacity and the percentage of low-income English learner and foster youth. The higher education provisions require that the UC and the CSU adopt a 5-year affordable student housing plan for each campus as a condition of receiving bond funds. These plans are intended to reflect local conditions and to consider the percentage of commuter students and the availability of affordable off-campus housing that is located near the campus. Key criteria for prioritizing projects will include the housing plans and also whether projects address fire and life safety, seismic, and critical deferred maintenance issues. If approved by the voters in March, the bill would advance the infrastructure needs of the K through 16 system and would greatly benefit the educational needs of the state and the CSU. We are asking the board to endorse the bond today. As noted by Vice Chancellor Ashley, the success of AB 48 relied on the advocacy of many throughout the CSU community, but I would like to take a moment to acknowledge a few key individuals. First, Senator Glazer, the author of the original legislation. Senator Glazer's willingness to champion our cause throughout the legislative session was critical for ensuring the prominence of higher education and specifically the CSU in the final bond negotiations. And the leadership of Pro Tem Tony Atkins ensured that significant bond funding for higher education was a priority in the Senate. I would also like to personally thank Trustees Day, McGrory, and Carney for their willingness to take my calls and engage key members in supporting our cause during the final days of negotiation. I want to close by thanking each of our 23 campuses and their presidents and government relations staff. During the final hours of session, the personal texts and constant communication with my staff helped to ensure that the bill passed off of the assembly floor with a final vote of 78-1. I can't think of a better example of the power of collaborative advocacy than AB 48. That concludes my report, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kathleen, for your presentation. Are there any questions? Jack?
Kathleen, what is the specific language with respect to debt service payments on the bonds?
So the language that's currently in the bond is reflective of language that has traditionally been in bond proposals, where the assumption has been that the debt service will be paid by the state. There is nothing that explicitly calls that out, but in all of our advocacy and in all of our conversations with those folks within the governor's administration who will be taking the bonds to market, there is an awareness that the bond is only helpful to us if the debt service is paid by the state. So we will be continuing to have those conversations. At this point, it is our expectation that the debt service is covered by the state, not by the CSU General Fund.
Okay, thank you.
Jane?
Well, congratulations and thanks to everybody at this table who worked so hard to move this forward. I'm not familiar with this, but are we going to work with all of our colleagues in higher education and K through 12 this is a large number for the citizens of California to support, and I think there's nothing more important than our getting behind this and informing the electorate how important this is. How are we going to deal with this issue?
The various campaign entities are still in the beginning stages of formation, but we have been working closely with UC since the introduction of the bill SB 14 at the beginning of the year to ensure its passage, but also establish the working relationship that will exist through the campaign. We've also been working with an entity called I use the shorthand calling them the Coalition, but the California Coalition for Public Higher Education, who have been working aggressively as well on both information and on the fundraising side. So I think the framework is in place for us to be working together with UC and then eventually with the K through 12 side, who will be running the campaign. And yes, we'll be working with all around the table as well.
Lillian?
I also want to thank everybody for their hard work, and particularly thank our ex-colleague, Steve Glazier, for pushing this. We really appreciate it. I had a question about this provision in here to adopt a 5-year affordable student housing plan. Can you flesh that out? Do you know any of the specifics of what that entails? Is it subsidized housing for certain students, short-term for homeless students?
So the language of the bill, it's my understanding in the negotiations, is something that was very important to the administration, and I think it's a broader concern about making sure that affordable housing is available in California. The specifics of the language in the bill do relate it back to financial aid needs relative to the amount of assistance a student gets. But beyond that, the language isn't specific to subsidized housing or any specific model. I do believe that there was an effort to acknowledge that housing is a complex issue across our 23 campuses. Many of our campuses do not provide housing for all students. Local jurisdictions have a variety of rules that need to be followed, and that's very different in the Central Valley as compared to San Francisco, for example. But I think it was a statement on the part of the administration of an expectation that each of our campuses, given whatever their local conditions were, would look to see how they could incorporate this into their planning as a condition of participating in the bond program. But it was very open-ended in terms of the ways that that could be approached by any of our campuses.
If I might just comment, just for clarity, is it's important to recognize that bond resources, if the people of California support it, would be used only for academic facilities. Housing facilities are a tub on their own financial bottom. But this is a nice confluence between, as Kathleen said, a high priority in California for this new administration about housing writ large, including student housing for low-income folk. And so to participate in the bond for academic stuff, you also need to have a commitment and activity on your campus to work on housing for our students on campus and in the campus environment. And so just wanted to be clear that there's no housing money in this bond.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Peter?
So there's no housing money. And I'm pretty sure all the campuses have a commitment to providing more housing where it makes sense. So really, our commitment is just to say, hey, we're going to keep really trying our best. Because we already know it's an issue and we want to make sure we're meeting the needs of our students with the limited resources we have. Terrific. So follow up on Trustee Furstenberg's question. I'll maybe be a little bit more blunt, because I think everybody sitting around this table has an obligation to help make this bond act successful. And that takes money. And I would hope that there is a structure in place where every single person sitting around this table can send a strong message by writing a personal check to support this initiative. We spend a lot of time, obviously, trying to help the CSUs be successful. I think it sends a great message to the donor community if there's 100% participation amongst trustees at whatever level you're comfortable and capable of to support this initiative. And I personally would, don't be surprised if you get a phone call from me. Actually, I probably shouldn't have said that because then you'll avoid my call. But if you get a call from me asking you to please support Californians for public higher education in this initiative, because it will mean a lot, not just in the near term, but for the next decades to help ECSU be successful.
Jane?
Peter, I'm sorry, but you're putting peer pressure on our student trustees. I think when you ask for 100% compliance, you mean with the exception of the student trustees, right?
Nope. I want them to each give whatever they're capable. If it's $5, that's fine. But I think 100% participation makes sense.
Go ahead, Jane.
I think what Peter said is really, really important, and that's really why I asked the question. This is coming up very soon, and we need to be in active mode. And I don't know what that means, but I you need to let us know right away what we need to do to make sure this doesn't fall through the cracks in March. And March is such a whole new experience for the state, right? And it's rather a intense moment. So we don't want this to slip through the cracks. I guess that's the point. So we're going to, Peter, we're going to depend on our team here to push us and lead us and pull us to make this happen, right?
Trustee Furstenberg, I'll just say it is at 6:30 this morning. I was on the phone with the Higher Ed Coalition, and Peter, your name came up. So they're going to be pleased to hear your. I'm going to have them go back and look at the tape. They'll be pleased to have heard your comments this morning. So I appreciate your comments, Trustee Furstenberg, and can assure you this will not fall through the cracks, nor will your participation as well. Thank you.
Governor?
Good morning. So this is an incredibly exciting opportunity. And as I have been traveling, visiting all of our campuses for the CSU, but also for the UC, We've been taking pictures of deferred maintenance challenges, pictures of water coming out of the ceiling, students improvising with buckets, students telling stories of flooding in their classrooms when it rains, a huge discrepancy between new buildings and old buildings. The reality that if some of these buildings don't get fixed, they're going to have to be taken out of service. And so, as we're trying to make access greater, we're looking at a real possibility that some of our facilities would have to be shut down, and that frankly, there aren't a lot of other options for how we're going to find the funds to fix these things. So it's not as much as some of us hoped for, but we're very happy with the $2 billion piece of this bond. I'll tell you, I also think it's an incredibly positive development that it's everything. It's K-12, it's pre-K, it's community colleges, the UC and the CSU. And so the message to the public is we need to fix our schools from the very for the very smallest of our students all the way up to our college students. And really, Jeannie, to your point, this is a campaign ahead of us. And certainly, Peter, I'm in, we're all in, I'm sure, to get out there and do the fundraising for the bond. But what we really need are votes. And so we have an opportunity, a special opportunity now as well, because we have voter centers on many of the campuses, and raising awareness among our students to mobilize and organize their friends to get out and vote for this is something else that we can really do. So I encourage everyone, I know with my social media, we're going to be out there raising awareness. We're going to be on college campuses. But this is, if not once in a lifetime opportunity, once in many decade opportunity, without which, we've got a really, really big problem. So to all of the presidents in the room, to everyone watching who cares about this institution, this is a very, very exciting opportunity, and I hope that people get out there and mobilize and organize. Again, not just on the fundraising side, but on the electorate side as well. I know I will be. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Morales?
Well, first of all, this is very important. And because it is important and it's so meaningful, I think we should make sure that there is a strategy on winning the Latino vote. This cannot pass without the Latino vote. So I think there has to be, first, among other things, spokespeople who speak Spanish, and also people who can develop, the case for how and why it matters for Latino families.
Thank you. Any additional comments or questions, Roland?
I reminded this body yesterday that IRFSA wants to get involved, and I remember that at the last board meeting, or maybe the previous one, then President William Blischke said that IRFSA is particularly interested in voter registration and census participation, and I think we can involve IRFSA, our retired faculty and staff, to help us out with that.
Well, I just want to remind everyone that we have 3.7 million alumni of this institution, most of which live in California. So I hope as we start developing our plans, I know that each of our presidents have been working very hard with their alumni at their campuses to expand their involvement and advocacy. So I hope that we don't forget that we have that incredible resource setting out there and that we tap them very early.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments? Hearing none. Support for AB 48 Public Preschool, K-12 and College Health and Safety Bond Act of 2020 is an action item before the Committee on Governmental Relations. Only committee members may vote at this time. May I have a motion? Is there a second? Any discussion?
I would just like to make sure it's clear in the motion that We're doing this with the express understanding that the debt service is the obligation of the state of California and not the CSU system.
Yep. Good. Okay. Do we accept that and get the signal from our legal advice over there? Okay, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The item is approved. Chairman Day, that concludes Chairman Day, that concludes the business of the Committee on Governmental Relations.
Thank you, Trustee Abrego. Trustee Campbell, will you please convene the Committee on Finance?
Thank you, Chairman.